I followed taillights that vanished suddenly, and nothing in my life has been the same since that night. The red glow had caught my attention on Highway 47, stretching through the dense forest outside of Millbrook, the kind of empty road where you could drive for miles and see nothing but trees and darkness. It was around 11 o'clock when I first noticed the vehicle ahead of me, its taillights blazing crimson against the pitch-black asphalt like two eyes watching my approach. The mysterious car seemed to drift effortlessly through the curves, moving at a pace that was neither too fast nor too slow, almost as though the driver knew exactly where they were going and wanted someone to follow. I don't know why I became so fixated on those lights, but there was something hypnotic about them, something that made me press harder on the accelerator and lean forward in my seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel with an intensity that should have alarmed me. The forest around me grew thicker as I drove deeper into the night, and the trees seemed to crowd closer to the road, their branches creating a tunnel of darkness above that my headlights couldn't fully penetrate. My speedometer climbed to 60, then 70, then 80 miles per hour as I desperately tried to maintain visual contact with those taillights. Every time I thought I might lose them as the road curved sharply, they would reappear, steady and unwavering, pulling me forward into regions of the forest I had never explored before. The car ahead never signaled, never slowed down, never gave any indication that its driver was aware of my presence. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow intentional, that I was being led somewhere by design rather than by accident. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat, a connection to the normal world that felt increasingly distant as the minutes ticked by and the landscape grew more primordial and untouched. I remember thinking about turning back, about abandoning this strange pursuit and returning to the highway that would take me home to my apartment and my predictable life, but something inside me refused to let those taillights disappear from my vision. It was almost like a compulsion, a deep-seated need to understand the mystery of what lay ahead, to discover the destination toward which I was being drawn. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was dangerous, that following a stranger's car deep into a forest in the middle of the night was the kind of reckless decision that appeared in true crime podcasts and cautionary tales shared between friends. Yet I continued forward, driven by a curiosity that seemed stronger than my survival instinct, stronger than my common sense, stronger than anything I had ever experienced before. The taillights began to flicker intermittently, as if the car ahead was moving in and out of some kind of interference zone, and I found myself leaning forward even more, my eyes straining to track their movement through the darkness. The road began to deteriorate beneath my wheels, the smooth asphalt giving way to cracked and broken pavement, and I knew I had ventured far beyond the well-maintained highways that connected civilization to civilization. The forest sounds had changed too, becoming more present, more insistent, with what sounded like creatures moving through the underbrush on either side of the road. I passed what looked like an abandoned gas station, its windows dark and its pumps long since removed, and I wondered how long it had been since anyone had stopped there, how long it had been since this part of the forest had seen regular traffic. The taillights ahead suddenly brightened, as if the driver had touched the brakes, and I instinctively eased off the accelerator, not wanting to draw too close, not wanting to alert whoever was in that car to my pursuit. We came around a bend and the forest opened up slightly, revealing what appeared to be a small clearing with the skeleton of an old building in the center, its roof long since collapsed and its walls standing like broken teeth against the starlit sky. The car ahead slowed considerably as we approached this clearing, and I felt my heart rate accelerate in response, my mouth going dry as I suddenly realized how isolated I actually was, how far from help, how vulnerable I had made myself by following this mysterious vehicle into this desolate landscape. My foot hovered over the brake pedal as we crawled toward the building, my eyes scanning the clearing for any signs of movement, any indication of what this place might be or why we had come here. The taillights ahead seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, as if the driver was deliberately communicating something through the medium of their brake lights, a Morse code message that I couldn't quite decode but sensed was vitally important. I managed to reduce my speed to a crawl, my car's engine now barely audible above the sound of wind moving through the forest, and as I watched, the car ahead of me began to move faster again, leaving the clearing behind and disappearing around the next curve. I accelerated to follow, not wanting to lose them, not willing to be abandoned out here without answers, without understanding, without resolution to this strange narrative that had begun to unfold the moment I had noticed those twin red lights on the highway. The road had narrowed even further, becoming almost a path rather than a thoroughfare, and I wondered if I would even be able to turn my car around. I needed to execute a rapid escape from whatever situation I had found myself in. The trees pressed so close now that branches occasionally scraped against my door and window, creating the sound of fingernails on glass, a scratching sensation that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I could see the taillights more clearly now, could make out details of the car's shape in the darkness, and I recognized it as a sedan, perhaps a decade old, painted a dark color that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The brake lights came on again, and I slowed to match its pace, and we began to climb, the road ascending into hills that I hadn't realized existed in this forest. The higher we climbed, the colder the air became, and I noticed my breath beginning to fog the inside of my windshield, creating patterns that looked almost like warnings written in condensation. My odometer had been recording this strange journey, and I realized that I had traveled nearly 40 miles into the forest without seeing a single other vehicle, a single house, a single sign of human habitation beyond the abandoned gas station. The isolation was complete, total, absolute, and I finally began to question the wisdom of this pursuit with genuine intensity, feeling fear creeping into my consciousness like cold water seeping through a crack in a dam. Yet the taillights continued their steady progression, and I continued to follow, bound to them by a connection I didn't fully understand and couldn't seem to break. We crested the hill, and the forest opened up suddenly, revealing a plateau of sorts, a flat expanse where the trees gave way to rough grassland and the stars above became visible in their full glory, stretching across the sky in the kind of concentration that could only be seen far away from city lights. In the distance, silhouetted against the faint light of those distant stars, I could see what appeared to be a structure of some kind, not large, but definitely constructed and intentional in its placement on this isolated plateau. The taillights ahead of me slowed, and I realized we were approaching the end of whatever journey this was, whatever destination had been predetermined by the driver of that mysterious car. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, could feel sweat dampening my palms despite the cold that now permeated the interior of my vehicle, and I knew that the moment of revelation was approaching, the moment when I would finally discover what this was all about, why I'd been led here, what awaited me in that structure that grew larger and more defined with every meter I drove forward. The taillights suddenly went dark, and I nearly gasped, suddenly deprived of the visual anchor that had guided me through this entire surreal journey, suddenly cast into a darkness so complete that I could barely see the road in front of me. I slowed my car to a cautious crawl, my headlights now the only illumination in the darkness, creating two cones of light that seemed impossibly small against the vastness of the night. The structure ahead became more visible as I approached it, and I could now see that it was something like a cabin, or perhaps a hunting lodge built from weathered logs and possessing a certain rustic charm that seemed out of place in this desolate landscape. A light came on inside the cabin, just a single lamp in what appeared to be a window facing the road, and I found myself slowing even further, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel as I contemplated my next move. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and drive away as quickly as possible, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this cabin and whatever mysteries it contained. But there was another instinct, deeper and more compel, that urged me forward, that insisted I complete this journey, that demanded I step out of my car and approach the cabin and discover what answers awaited me inside. I pulled my car to a stop about 50 yards from the cabin's entrance, leaving my headlights on, and I sat in the darkness of the car's interior, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to find the courage to move. A figure appeared in the window of the cabin, illuminated by the lamp's glow, and I found myself staring at this silhouette, trying to discern details, trying to determine if this person was male or female, young or old, friend or threat. The figure raised what appeared to be a hand, not in a threatening gesture, but rather in a gesture that could have been interpreted as a wave, a greeting, or perhaps an acknowledgement of my arrival. My hand found the door handle of my car and I pulled it open, the cold night air rushing in and surrounding me, carrying with it the scent of evergreen trees and something else, something I couldn't quite identify but that made my primitive brain send urgent signals of caution and concern. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling slightly unsteady beneath me, my eyes remaining fixed on that figure in the window as I slowly made my way toward the cabin. The grassland beneath my feet was rough and uneven, sprinkled with what felt like frost, and the only sounds were the sound of my footsteps and the distant wind moving through the trees at the edge of the plateau. The figure in the window remained motionless, and I found myself wondering if it was even real, if it might be some kind of trick of the light, some phantom created by my fear-stricken mind in response to this bizarre situation. I reached the door of the cabin, and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand raised and hesitant, unable to decide whether to knock, to push the door open, or to turn around and run back to my car and my headlights, and the illusion of safety they provided. The door suddenly swung open from the inside, and the figure emerged fully into the night, and I found myself staring at a woman who appeared to be in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun, wearing clothes that seemed equally as weathered as the cabin itself. Her face bore an expression that could have been interpreted as sad, or perhaps relieved, or perhaps some combination of both, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something to happen. She asked me my name, and I found myself answering automatically, still in a state of shock and confusion that seemed to be affecting my ability to make conscious decisions about my responses and actions. She nodded slowly, as if my name had confirmed something she had long suspected, and then she explained that she had been waiting for me, that the car with the taillights had been sent by someone I used to know, someone from my past who had always believed that I would eventually find my way here. My mind reeled as she spoke, trying to process her words, trying to understand how someone could have orchestrated this elaborate journey, how someone could have known that I would follow those taillights, how this entire scenario could possibly have been arranged. The woman explained that my grandfather had been a member of a group, a society of sorts, that had existed for decades in this part of the forest, that had carried out research and experiments that had never been made public, that had generated knowledge that had been carefully guarded and passed down through generations of initiates. She further explained that my grandfather had wished for me to eventually become part of this society, had believed that I possessed qualities that would make me a valuable member of their organization, and had arranged before his death 10 years ago for some form of signal to be sent to me when the time was right. The woman invited me inside, and I found myself following her into the cabin, still unable to fully comprehend what was happening, still feeling as though I might wake up at any moment and discover that this was all some elaborate dream. The interior of the cabin was warmer than I had expected, with a fireplace providing a steady glow of warmth and light, and the walls were lined with bookshelves that contained hundreds, perhaps thousands, of volumes that appeared to be handwritten journals and leather-bound records. The woman began to explain the history of the organization, speaking about its founding in the early 20th century, about the brilliant minds that had been drawn to this isolated location in search of understanding and truth. She told me about the research that had been conducted here, about the discoveries that had been made, about the knowledge that had been accumulated and carefully organized and preserved. According to her account, the society had been involved in fields of study that ranged from theoretical physics to consciousness research to the study of ancient texts and their hidden meanings. She showed me journals written in my grandfather's own hand, documents that detailed his years of participation in this organization, his contributions to various research projects, his thoughts and observations about the nature of reality and existence and human potential. Hours passed as I sat in that cabin, reading by firelight, listening to the woman's explanations and revelations, gradually beginning to understand the contours of this world that I had been pulled into through the simple act of following two red taillights into the darkness. The woman explained that the organization had a specific purpose, that it was dedicated to the accumulation and preservation of knowledge that the outside world was not yet ready to understand or accept, that it served as a kind of repository for truths that had been discovered but were being suppressed or deliberately hidden by mainstream institutions. She spoke of connections between historical events and hidden influences, of patterns that she claimed could be detected in the trajectory of human civilization if one knew where to look and what to look for. I listened with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, my engineer's mind wanting to demand evidence and data, but also finding myself drawn into the narrative, finding myself beginning to consider the possibility that there might be more to the world than what I had learned in school or read in conventional sources. As dawn began to break over the plateau, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the woman explained that I had been given a choice, that I could leave this cabin and return to my previous life, that I could forget everything I had learned here and never mention it to anyone, and that I would never be contacted again. Alternatively, I could choose to stay, could choose to become part of this organization, could choose to dedicate myself to the pursuit and preservation of the knowledge that had been accumulated in this hidden society. She explained that if I chose to stay, I would be expected to make a significant commitment, that I would be required to spend extended periods at this location and others like it, that I would have to leave behind certain aspects of my previous life in order to fully participate in the work of the organization. The decision seemed impossibly large, impossibly significant, as if the entire trajectory of my life hung in the balance, dependent on the choice I made in this moment as the sun rose over the forest. I thought about my apartment in the city, about my job as a civil engineer, about the comfortable but unfulfilling routine that had come to define my existence over the past decade. I thought about my parents, who had never spoken to me about my grandfather's involvement in any kind of secret society, who had seemed content to ignore certain aspects of their family history and move forward with their lives in the conventional world. I thought about my friends, about the relationships that had become superficial over time, about the sense of disconnection I had always felt from mainstream society, despite being, on the surface, a functioning member of it. As I considered these things, it became increasingly clear to me that my previous life, while stable and respectable, had always felt somehow temporary, as if I had been waiting for something, as if some part of me had always known that there was something more, something different, something that called to me from beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. I turned to the woman, and I told her that I wanted to stay, that I wanted to learn, that I wanted to understand what my grandfather had spent so much of his life pursuing in this isolated corner of the world. Her face broke into what appeared to be a genuine smile, and she extended her hand and congratulated me, welcoming me officially to the organization whose name I still did not know but whose purposes and methods I had only begun to comprehend. She explained that the first stage of my initiation would begin immediately, that I would be required to read extensively from the archives in the cabin, that I would be introduced to other members of the organization, and that I would gradually be incorporated into the research projects that were currently underway. She led me upstairs to a small bedroom that she said had been prepared for me, that had been waiting for me for 10 years, ever since my grandfather's death, when the decision had been made to eventually bring me into the fold. Over the following weeks and months, my life transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. I learned that there were dozens of members of the organization scattered across the country and the world, that they maintained careful communication through encrypted channels and periodic meetings at various locations like this cabin. I was introduced to people with impressive credentials from prestigious universities, people who had abandoned conventional academic careers to dedicate themselves to research that could not be published in mainstream journals or presented at conferences without risking their credibility and their careers. I was taught methodologies that blended scientific rigor with what I would have previously dismissed as pseudoscience, and I gradually began to understand that the line between these categories was more blurred than I had ever realized. The work was fascinating, challenging, deeply intellectual, and it offered a sense of purpose that I had been lacking in my previous life. Yet as the months turned into years, I began to experience growing doubts about certain aspects of the organization's work and philosophy. Some of the claims that were being made seemed to stretch beyond what the evidence could support, and when I raised these concerns, I was sometimes encouraged to have faith, to trust the wisdom that had been accumulated over the organization's long history, to recognize that my lack of comprehension was a reflection of my own limitations rather than flaws in the organization's theories. I discovered that some members of the organization had become increasingly isolated from the outside world, that some had come to believe that mainstream society was fundamentally corrupt and beyond redemption, that the only path was to focus entirely on the work of the organization and to view all external relationships and obligations as distractions from the true purpose of their lives. I began to wonder whether I had stumbled into something noble and misunderstood, or whether I had become trapped in some kind of cult, whether the taillights that had led me into the forest had brought me to enlightenment or to entrapment. The taillights themselves became almost symbolic in my mind, a representation of the moment when I had made the decision to abandon the known world and venture into the unknown, to follow something I didn't understand, to trust in a process that had seemed to be carefully orchestrated from the start. I often found myself thinking about that night, about the moment when I had stood outside my car looking at the cabin, about the moment when I could have turned around and returned to my normal life, about the moment when I had chosen instead to step into the unknown. I wondered if other people had been drawn to the organization through similar processes, whether there were others out there in the world who had seen mysterious taillights and had followed them, and whether they too had found themselves questioning their decision as time passed and they came to understand more about the true nature of the organization they had joined. Years passed, and I eventually became one of the senior members of the organization, entrusted with knowledge that had been carefully guarded, responsible for introducing new initiates to the work and philosophy of the society. I found myself in the position of being the one who sent the cars with their mysterious taillights into the night, hoping that the right people would feel compelled to follow them, hoping that I was identifying individuals who had the potential to become valuable contributors to our work. The woman who had first Ted me at the cabin had eventually stepped back from an active role, and I had taken over much of the responsibility for the day-to-day operations of the facility and the broader coordination of the organization's various research projects. But I had never fully resolved my doubts, had never completely embraced the certainty that many of my colleagues seemed to possess, had never been able to quiet the voice in my mind that whispered warnings about the dangers of isolation, groupthink, and the gradual erosion of critical thinking in the face of charismatic leadership and appealing narratives. I often wondered what the real truth was about the organization's founding, about the nature and validity of our research, about whether we were genuinely preserving precious knowledge or were instead perpetuating a beautiful but ultimately false mythology that gave meaning to lives that might otherwise feel empty and purposeless. The night that changed everything came on what would have been my grandfather's 100th birthday. I was preparing for the organization's traditional ceremony when I found an old journal hidden in a compartment of my grandfather's desk that I had not discovered in all my years at the facility. The journal was dated to the year before his death, and in it he described his growing disillusionment with the organization. His realization that much of what he had devoted his life to was built on foundations of assumption and belief, rather than genuine evidence. His plan to leave the organization and begin writing a tell-all book that would expose the organization to public scrutiny. The journal revealed that my grandfather had never intended for me to be drawn into the organization after his death, that the plan to send the mysterious taillights had been created by others after his passing, using his name and memory as justification for expanding the organization's membership. I found myself sitting in that cabin where I had spent so many years, holding my grandfather's journal, realizing that I had been deceived from the very beginning, that the carefully orchestrated event that had seemed like destiny had instead been a sophisticated manipulation designed to recruit me into an organization my own grandfather had been planning to expose. That realization set me on a path toward my own eventual departure from the organization, a painful process that involved questioning everything I had come to believe, acknowledging the ways in which I had been manipulated, and taking responsibility for my own role in manipulating others who had been drawn into the same elaborate system of control and indoctrination. I contacted my grandfather's lawyer, found a draft of the manuscript he had been preparing, and began the difficult work of verifying his claims, separating genuine research from mythology, and trying to understand what parts of the organization's work might actually contain value and what parts were fundamentally compromised by a foundation of deception. I followed taillights that vanished suddenly, and that moment of following red lights into darkness became a pivot point in my life that I have never fully escaped. A moment that demonstrated to me how easily I could be led astray, how powerful the human need for meaning and belonging could be, and how carefully one must examine the motivations and claims of those who promise answers to the deepest questions of existence. The lights vanished, but their reflection remained with me forever, a constant reminder of the night when I made a choice that altered everything that came after, a choice made in darkness that illuminated truths I was not prepared to face, but eventually learned to accept and to move beyond. After discovering my grandfather's journal and beginning my départ from the organization, I spent nearly 2 years in a state of psychological limbo, caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither. The cabin in the forest became a place of torment rather than enlightenment, and I found myself walking the same paths I had walked for years, with a completely different understanding of what they represented, what they meant, what they had cost me in terms of time and authentic human connection. I had to carefully extract myself from the organization without alerting the leadership to the full extent of my knowledge and my doubts, playing a role that became increasingly difficult as my sense of morality reasserted itself against the rationalizations and justifications I had learned to accept while I was fully embedded in the system. The other members of the organization began to notice that something had changed in me, that my enthusiasm for the work had diminished, that I was asking different kinds of questions and making subtle decisions that diverged from the established doctrines and practices that governed our daily lives and our research protocols. I eventually engineered a situation where I could claim a family emergency in the outside world, citing my aging parents and their need for my help in managing their affairs and their medical decisions. The leadership of the organization, by this point more loosely structured since several of the senior members had passed away, reluctantly granted me a leave of absence, though I could sense their suspicion about whether I would actually return once I had tasted freedom again. I packed a single bag with the most essential items from my room, making a deliberate point of leaving everything else behind to demonstrate my intention to eventually return, all while knowing with absolute certainty that I would never voluntarily come back to that plateau, that cabin, that community of misguided seekers and true believers that had somehow managed to captivate and hold me for so many years. I drove away from the facility in the early morning, watching the cabin recede in my rearview mirror, trying to convince myself that this departure was temporary, that I was just taking a break, that I would sort through my thoughts and eventually return to the work I had dedicated my life to, even though every fiber of my being was screaming that I was fleeing from something I should never have become a part of in the first place. The drive back to the world I had abandoned years earlier was surreal and disorienting in ways I could not have anticipated. The forest slowly gave way to towns and villages. Civilization reasserted itself through the gradual increase in visible human activity and infrastructure, and I found myself becoming increasingly anxious as I approached the areas where normal people lived normal lives, pursued normal careers, and engaged in the ordinary pursuits and relationships that I had come to view with a mixture of disdain and envy while I was immersed in the organization's ideology. My parents' house stood exactly as I remembered it, though my mother had made some minor renovations to the kitchen, and they welcomed me with a kind of cautious affection that suggested they had long since given up trying to fully understand the choices I had made or the path I had chosen to walk. I told them that I was taking a temporary leave from my work, that I needed time to sort through some personal issues, that I was considering whether my current career path was truly fulfilling to me anymore, and they seemed satisfied with this explanation, grateful that I was finally back in contact with them after years of sporadic visits and increasingly distant phone calls. Over the following weeks, I began the difficult process of integrating myself back into mainstream society, attempting to rebuild the connections I had allowed to atrophy during my years with the organization, and trying to understand who I had been before I followed those taillights, and who I had become in the years that followed. I reconnected with a few college friends who had remained in the city, though I discovered that most of them had moved on. had built families and careers and lives that had progressed significantly in my absence, and I found myself feeling like a ghost of my former self, trying to participate in conversations about mortgages and school districts and workplace politics, while my mind remained partially locked in the forest, still wrestling with the implications of what I had discovered and the choices I had made. One friend, Marcus, seemed to sense that something significant had happened to me, that my absence from society had not been a simple career change or a temporary wandering, but rather something more fundamental that had altered the very core of who I was as a person. Marcus invited me to dinner one evening, and over wine and carefully prepared food, I found myself beginning to open up about certain aspects of my experience, carefully editing the details to protect both myself and the organization, not entirely sure whether legal action might still be possible if I revealed too much, not wanting to expose the organization to public scrutiny, without having fully verified my grandfather's claims and my own understanding of what was actually true about their research and their methods. Marcus listened with a kind of patient intensity, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated a genuine desire to understand what I had been through, rather than to judge me for my choices, or to dismiss my experience as the foolishness of a young man who had been manipulated by charismatic leaders and appealing narratives. By the end of the evening, Marcus had suggested that I consider speaking with a therapist, someone trained in helping people who had left high-control groups or cult-like organizations, someone who could help me process the trauma of my experience and begin to rebuild my sense of identity and self-worth in a way that was healthier and more grounded in reality. I took his advice, and I began seeing a therapist named Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 60s who had spent much of her career studying the psychology of belief systems and the mechanisms by which groups maintain control over their members through a combination of isolation, information control, and gradual erosion of critical thinking. Our sessions were intense and often painful, as I was forced to confront the ways in which I had rationalized the organization's more questionable practices, the ways in which I had allowed myself to be seduced by the appeal of belonging to something larger than myself, the ways in which I had participated in the manipulation and recruitment of others who were vulnerable in much the same way that I had been vulnerable when those taillights first caught my attention on that fateful night. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my experience was not unusual, that groups like the organization I had been part of had been operating for decades, that the psychological mechanisms they used were remarkably consistent across different groups and different time periods, and that recovery from that kind of immersion required both intellectual understanding and emotional healing. As I worked through my therapy, I became increasingly focused on what my grandfather had been trying to expose before his death, on verifying whether the claims he had made in his journal were accurate, and on determining whether any of the organization's research had genuine scientific merit or whether it was all built on a foundation of pseudoscience, logical fallacies, and wishful thinking. I began reaching out to academics in relevant fields, carefully posing hypothetical questions about the kinds of research the organization claimed to be conducting, trying to get a sense of whether anyone else in the scientific community had taken their work seriously, or whether the organization operated entirely in isolation from mainstream academic discourse. I discovered that some of the research topics the organization focused on were legitimate areas of scientific inquiry, but that the organization's methodologies and conclusions had never been submitted for peer review or publication in reputable journals, which suggested that either they were unwilling to have their work subjected to rigorous scrutiny, or they recognized that their work would not survive that scrutiny. I also began investigating the history of the organization more systematically, reaching out to a journalist named David Harris, who had spent years investigating high-control groups and alternative organizations that operated on the margins of mainstream society. David was intensely interested in my story, though he was cautious about the potential legal ramifications of publishing anything based on my account, and he advised me to gather as much documentary evidence as possible before he would be willing to proceed with any kind of journalistic investigation or exposé. This led me on a strange and sometimes dangerous odyssey to reconnect with the organization from a new angle, to reach out to former members who had left over the years, and to gather their accounts of their experiences and their understanding of what the organization actually was. and what it was actually doing beneath the surface of its official mission and stated purposes. What emerged from these investigations was a picture far more complicated than I had initially believed. The organization was not the monolithic entity I had assumed it to be, but rather a collection of semi-autonomous chapters or cells that maintained loose connections to one another through a central coordinating body. Some chapters appeared to be engaged in legitimate scientific research, while others seemed to exist primarily as communities for isolated individuals seeking belonging and meaning. Some of the leadership had genuine credentials and had published work in reputable journals, while others appeared to be engaged in various forms of fraud and manipulation. The organization itself seemed to have evolved significantly over its long history, with the current iteration being quite different from what it had been in earlier decades, though the underlying narrative and mythology had remained relatively consistent. I discovered that my grandfather had not been alone in his disillusionment. Several other long-time members had begun to question the organization's direction and its claims by the time of his death, and there had apparently been some kind of internal crisis or conflict that had eventually resulted in a purge of sorts, with the skeptics and questioners being gradually marginalized and eventually pushed out or breaking away entirely. The narrative that had been created after my grandfather's death, the story that he had wanted me to eventually be brought into the organization, appeared to be a complete fabrication, a manipulation designed to give the organization's recruiting efforts a kind of legitimacy and a connection to an impressive historical figure who might lend credibility to their ongoing work. As I gathered more and more information and evidence, I became increasingly aware that I was being watched, that the organization had apparently assigned someone to monitor my activities and my contacts, that my departure had not been as clean and as unsuspected as I had believed. I noticed a car that appeared to follow me on several occasions. I received phone calls in which no one spoke, but the line remained open, and I found evidence that someone had accessed my email account without my permission. The organization was apparently not willing to let me walk away quietly, not willing to allow me to potentially expose their secrets to public scrutiny, not willing to risk having one of their former senior members become a source of information for journalists or researchers who might be interested in investigating their activities and their methods. This realization forced me to make a difficult decision. I could attempt to go public with everything I knew, accepting the personal risks and the legal dangers that might come from such a public exposure, or I could attempt to negotiate with the organization to convince them that my silence could be purchased, that I had no intention of exposing them if they would allow me to simply disappear back into mainstream society and build a normal life for myself. Both options felt like compromises with my own integrity and my own sense of what was right. Both options involved accepting that the organization would continue to operate and continue to manipulate vulnerable people into joining their ranks. Both options meant that my grandfather's intended exposure would never come to pass, and his vision of revealing the organization to public scrutiny would remain forever unrealized. I consulted with David the journalist, and we made a calculated decision to proceed with publishing an article based on my account, though I would remain anonymous for the purposes of the publication, and David would use only the information and evidence that could be independently verified through interviews with other former members and through documentary evidence that would be difficult or the organization to credibly deny or challenge. The process of working with David was extraordinarily time-consuming and emotionally draining, as we went through my account multiple times, challenging my recollections, asking me to provide specific dates and details, requiring me to distinguish between things I had directly experienced, things I had been told by organization members who might themselves have been deceived or might have been deliberately misleading, and things that I had inferred or concluded based on indirect evidence. The article was eventually published in a national magazine, and it created a modest stir, attracting attention from academics who studied cult dynamics, from journalists who had been investigating other high-control groups, and from current and former members of the organization itself. the organization issued a formal statement denying the allegations, characterizing me as a disgruntled former member whose account was motivated by personal grievances and psychological disturbance, and attempting to paint the article as a biased attack on a group whose only crime was maintaining unconventional beliefs and practices that did not conform to mainstream society's expectations. However, the article also prompted several other former members to come forward and add their own accounts to the public record, providing additional corroboration for many of the claims I had made and expanding the narrative in ways that suggested the organization's problems were more systemic and more deeply rooted than even I had initially believed. In the months following the article's publication, my life became a strange mixture of liberation and continued threat. I was liberated in the sense that I was no longer maintaining the pretense of eventually returning to the organization, that my break was now complete and irrevocable, that I could stop living in a state of psychological ambiguity and could begin to forge a genuine identity in the mainstream world. Yet I remained under a kind of threat, both from the organization's surveillance and from the personal dangers that could arise from having publicly exposed secrets that some members might desperately want to keep hidden. David advised me to consider relocating, to move somewhere geographically distant from both the organization's headquarters and the city where I had grown up, to create as much distance as possible between myself and anyone who might seek revenge or retaliation for my role in exposing the organization's operations. I took his advice and relocated to a small city in the Pacific Northwest, renting an apartment in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew anything about my past, where I could rebuild my life from the ground up without the weight of my previous experiences constantly bearing down on me. I found work as a consultant, using my engineering background to help various companies solve technical problems, and I gradually began to construct a life that was, on the surface at least, indistinguishable from that of any other professional working toward financial security and personal fulfillment in the conventional world. Yet beneath the surface, I remained fundamentally changed by my experience, unable to simply return to the state of naive acceptance that I had inhabited before that night when I followed the taillights into the forest. I continued my therapy with Dr. Chen via video calls, and I remained in contact with David and with several of the other former members I had connected with during my investigation, forming a kind of informal support network of people who had all experienced similar forms of manipulation and indoctrination, and who were all working to rebuild their lives and their sense of self in the aftermath of their experiences. We shared articles and research. We provided each other with emotional support and practical advice, and we collectively worked toward a kind of reckoning with what had happened to us and how we could move forward without bitterness or anger consuming us entirely. Many of us felt a sense of responsibility toward helping other people avoid the trap we had fallen into, toward educating the public about how these organizations operate and recruit, toward making information available that might help vulnerable people recognize the warning signs and resist the appeals and manipulations that these groups deploy so skillfully. Years passed, and I eventually became aware that the organization had changed significantly in response to the exposure and the public scrutiny that had been generated by David's article and by the subsequent accounts from other former members. The organization had moved its primary facility from the Plateau in the forest to a new location in another state, and it had apparently undergone some kind of significant reorganization that had resulted in a smaller, more tightly controlled membership and a shift away from some of the more radical claims and practices that had characterized it in earlier years. Some of the leadership had stepped down or passed away, and new leadership had taken over, apparently with a different vision and a different set of priorities regarding the organization's future direction and its role in society. I wondered sometimes about the woman who had greeted me at the cabin on that first morning, who had made the choice to welcome me into the organization with such apparent sincerity and warmth. David's investigation had suggested that she had left the organization a few years before my departure, that she had apparently come to recognize some of the problems with the organization's approach and had decided to distance herself from. I made several attempts to contact her, to try to understand her perspective on the organization and on the role she had played in recruiting and indoctrinating new members, but she refused all my attempts at communication, apparently preferring to leave that chapter of her life behind her completely. What remained with me most vividly from my entire experience was not the knowledge I had accumulated or the insights I had gained into the nature of belief systems and group psychology, but rather the memory of that moment when I had stood outside the cabin as dawn broke, holding my grandfather's journal and realizing that everything I had believed about the trajectory of my life had been based on a foundation of deception and manipulation. That moment of revelation had been simultaneously devastating and liberating, had stripped away layers of illusion, but had also left me vulnerable and uncertain, had forced me to confront questions about the nature of truth and the reliability of my own perceptions and judgments that I was still wrestling with years later. I began writing my own account of my experience, not for publication necessarily, but rather as a kind of personal reckoning with what had happened to me and as a way of processing and understanding the experience in greater depth. The writing itself became a kind of therapy, allowing me to organize my memories and my thoughts in a way that gave them coherence and meaning, allowing me to see patterns and connections that had not been apparent when my experience was still unfolding in real time. I wrote about the specific mechanisms of manipulation that the organization had used, the psychological vulnerabilities that had made me susceptible to those manipulations, the warning signs that I had ignored or rationalized away, and the specific moments when I had had opportunities to recognize the truth but had chosen, instead, to maintain my belief in the organization's mission and values. As I neared the completion of my written account, I began to receive messages from people who had read about my experience, either through David's article or through word of mouth passing through various networks of people interested in cult dynamics and group psychology. Some of these messages were from current or former members of the organization. Some were from family members of people who were currently involved with the organization and who were desperately seeking information and strategies for helping their loved ones recognize the manipulation and extract themselves from the group. I found myself becoming an informal counselor to some of these people, sharing my experience and my insights, helping them understand what their loved ones might be experiencing, and offering strategies for approaching difficult conversations about the reality of the group's actual practices and beliefs versus the narratives that the organization presented to its members. I also began to notice that there was a broader movement developing among former members of various high-control groups and cult-like organizations, a movement toward collective accountability and healing, toward changing legislation and institutional practices to better protect vulnerable people from manipulation and exploitation, toward creating resources and support systems for people attempting to leave these groups and rebuild their lives. I participated in conferences and workshops dedicated to these issues. I contributed to academic research on cult dynamics and recovery, and I eventually decided to pursue formal training as a counselor who specialized in helping people who had been involved in high-control groups. The irony of this trajectory was not lost on me. I had followed Taillights into the darkness, had sought answers to fundamental questions about existence and meaning, had devoted years of my life to what I believed was the pursuit of truth, and I had eventually discovered that the path I had chosen was built on deception and manipulation. Yet, instead of becoming cynical or entirely disillusioned with the human search for meaning, I had come to understand that this search was legitimate and important, that the problem was not with seeking answers to profound questions, but rather with trusting blindly in charismatic leaders and isolated communities that claimed to possess those answers but were actually engaged in the perpetuation of their own power and influence. My new path involved honoring that original impulse toward seeking truth and meaning, but doing so in a way that was more grounded in reality, more skeptical of grand narratives that claimed to possess ultimate truth, and more committed to the kind of incremental, collaborative, evidence-based pursuit of understanding that characterized genuine scientific inquiry and authentic human wisdom. I eventually moved back to the city where I had grown up, partly out of a desire to be closer to my aging parents, partly out of a recognition that I had spent enough time running from my past and that I could face it head-on without being consumed by it. I reconnected with old friends, I rebuilt relationships that had been damaged by my years of absence and isolation, and I gradually became reintegrated into the community in a way that felt authentic rather than performative. I started a private practice as a counselor, specializing in helping people who had experienced manipulation and control in various group contexts, and I found that the work was deeply meaningful, that I could utilize my experience and my understanding to help others avoid the trap that I had fallen into, or to help them recover and rebuild their lives after leaving similar groups. The taillights that had vanished that night so many years ago continued to haunt me, but in a different way now. They no longer represented a mystery to be solved or a path to be followed, but rather a symbol of the moment when I had made a choice that had irrevocably altered the course of my life. A choice that had been based on incomplete information and vulnerability, but that had ultimately led me toward a path of greater authenticity and deeper understanding of human psychology and the dangers of isolation and groupthink. I had followed the lights and they had vanished, leaving me in darkness. But in that darkness I had eventually found my way toward a more genuine light, not the seductive glow of certainty and belonging that had drawn me in, but rather the more modest and honest light of incremental understanding and authentic connection with others who were engaged in the same difficult work of building meaningful lives in the face of uncertainty and the ever-present danger of self-deception.